Rylan, we are...
Oh, I thought we were going to get a countdown.
Here we are. Hey, friends. Hello, my friends.
We're back. One more class.
This is the last time that we're going to do this on Wednesday nights online for a bit. We're about to transition to our summer Wednesday night offering, which is going to be... Uh-oh.
You have done something.
I did do something. I did several things.
Shenanigans. Actually. What would the last class be without some shenanigans?
Yeah, that's right. That's kind of been a tradition here. But this is going to be the last online class. Next week, we're starting with our on-campus classes again on Wednesday night. We're going to have one adult offering. It's going to be called Brown Bag Bible Study. And we're going to be talking about some of the core teachings of Jesus. Okay?
All right.
And we're going to have we'll email out a form if you want to have us bring you food, or if you would like to, just bring your own dinner or something like that, then you're welcome to do that too. But we'll provide like a box lunch if you want to pay. It'll be like $5 or something like that.
Yeah.
And we'll send out information about that. Probably starting Friday, and then up into next week we'll be taking those kind of orders all the way up until Wednesday. Next Wednesday at noon, we'll try to get all that in. Okay, so I'm looking forward to that. I think it's going to be a great study. I'm really looking forward to diving into the teaching of Jesus.
How would one send in an order?
Well, like I'll have we send out a link, and there'll be like a Google.
Oh, so it'll be
form,
like in an email.
Yeah. We'll send out an email, and then we'll put a button on the website too.
Okay. And we're going to be studying the teachings of Jesus.
That's right.
You off there. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, so I really am looking forward to that. I've been working on that for a little bit, and looking forward to you guys being a part of it. Normally it's going to be in the gym, okay? But the weekend, there's going to be a wedding, okay? Nathan Hughes' wedding. And so they're going to be decorating in the gym. So the first one is going to be in the reception room.
Okay.
Okay, but after that,
where
will be in the
overflow seating be when we fill up the reception room?
We'll be improvising at that point. So, okay. But improvisation, we can do that.
Yeah,
easily.
We were both on improv.
What is this whole thing, if not improvisation, Rylan? So, hey, check in, tell us hi. Betty Lawrence is already in the comments there on Facebook. If you are jumping in, please say to let us know that you're there as well. Hey, buddy, I'm online here, so
hey,
it's not really
look at that.
There's
Kelly.
To do
hey, Kelly.
The FaceTime conversation. Okay, all right, bye.
I'm here to attest. You did not call her.
It did not seem like it.
That is not what happened.
But it seemed like it to her. Okay,
all right. Yeah.
This is enough shenanigans. We got a lot of stuff that we're going to cover today, because today is a bridge between the study that we've been doing on Paul and the upcoming study on Jesus. A lot of people, Rylan, think that after Jesus started, his thing with the disciples and all that, and then after his ascension, that Paul just kind of came in and just threw it all out the window and started his own completely different branch of Christianity.
Pauline.
Pauline Christianity. And there were considerable differences between the church in Paul's era, okay, and the time of Jesus. There were some significant things. First of all, there were a lot more Christians, okay, and the even bigger change is that Paul was trying to translate the message of Jesus into the Greco-Roman world, the Gentile world. Yeah. The Jesus phenomenon was the Jesus movement, I guess we should say, was primarily a Jewish phenomenon, right? And so what we see when the church moved out of Judea or out of Galilee into the rest of the Roman world, of course there's some stuff that's going to be different, okay? But I want to argue, Mr. Rylan Cox, that Paul actually gives us some indications of some things that are part of the core teachings of Jesus, and I want us to highlight a little bit. So what I want to do in our class today is build a bridge between what happened in the time of Jesus' teachings to the time of Paul. All right, and at times Paul is very explicit about that, and other times it's just kind of an allusion. He kind of alludes to something that Jesus did or taught. But I want us to draw out a couple of those places today, and then work from that. Miss Betty, we are not going to be online for this time slot on Wednesdays, but we will have some other online stuff that'll be there, kind of working in parallel. Okay, so that's the answer to that. But we will continue to have some online stuff, but it will not be Wednesday night at 6:30 thing. There
Yeah,
we're not gonna. A little bit after.
We're
that.
not gonna film that. We can
Right.
figure out a way
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
that yet.
That's right. That's right.
Maybe one day.
All right. So thanks for asking that question, though. All right. So let's start off, Rylan, and let's look in the most explicit reference to the story of Jesus that we have in Paul. Okay, and that comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Okay. And we alluded to this last week, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in it.
Use your
Okay. But in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is teaching the Corinthians about the Lord's Supper, and he goes over something that he's already told them. Okay. He says explicitly, "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you." Right. So he's already given these instructions to the Corinthians, but fortunately for us, he shares them again because it's the most direct narrative part of Paul in terms of Jesus' story. It's one of the only spaces where Paul refers to some specific episode in the Gospels, besides kind of the big picture, he was crucified and buried and rose again, you know, kind of stuff. Okay? This is what Paul says. He says, "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" And we talked about how last week, I think we mentioned that this is like the first real gospel story, okay? Because the others were written later. The four gospels that we think of as the gospels were written later. And so this is like one of the first written stories about Jesus that we know about, that we have in this kind of form.
Yeah. Is this similar to the way that Luke tells it? Because we know that Paul and Luke were friends and they worked together, and maybe Luke was doing all this research, right, to write his gospel, and maybe he passed that on to Paul.
Yeah, I think it has some things in common with Luke's and with Mark's versions. Okay. Now, all of those versions are slightly different, but I think the closest connections between these two, between this text and the Gospels, are between Luke and then the Markan version. But I'd have to look a little more closer to that.
Sure.
That's a good stumper question. You got me on that.
Keep
All
them
right.
coming.
We mentioned this one before, so I just wanted to bring it up because it is the most direct thing that we have where Paul talks about a particular episode in the life of Jesus. But there's lots of other things too, okay? For instance, the first one that I want to talk about is in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, okay? And 2 Corinthians 10, Paul, remember, the 2 Corinthian letter is very emotional. He's appealing. There's like conflict between Paul and the Corinthians in some ways, and he's trying to really get their attention and get them to listen to him and follow his instructions, okay? And the beginning of the 10th chapter, he says this: "I myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I am away." Now, some people think he's like speaking tongue in cheek when he says that a little bit, but I really do think that Paul is saying, he's calling attention to whether or not he's really meek or humble and bold in his writings. I don't know what the case is there, but of course we don't really know what his personality was in person.
Yeah.
Although it was fiery enough that he both won people over and also got himself in a lot of trouble, right? So
maybe he's being like sarcastic here.
Maybe, yeah. Or maybe he's like drawing on what they say or his opponents say.
Okay.
He's big and bad when he writes letters, but when he's here, he's just,
yeah.
he's not really that impressive, is he?
Talking some smack.
Right. Well, that's kind of beside the point about this particular text, right? Because look at what he's calling on, right? He's calling on the meekness and gentleness of Christ, right? And so he's kind of trying to connect his behavior with what he perceives in the person of Jesus, right? And if you remember, there's that text where Jesus even says about himself, "Come to me, all those you who are heavy laden, and tired and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." And he says, "For I am meek and lowly in heart," right? Like that's Jesus' own description of himself, is that in that invitation of people to come and follow him. That's my yoke is easy, my burden is light, kind of that text, right? And in that text, like Jesus talks about his own nature as being meek and humble, right? And Paul kind of calls on to that here, right? He's saying, hooking something not just on this like cosmic identity of Christ, but on something about the person of Jesus. That Jesus' identity, Jesus' person, was meek and humble and gentle,
Mostly.
Right.
Usually.
Well, hey, listen, and for Paul too. I mean, that's the point, right? Like
Yeah.
Paul recognizes that. Remember the Christian virtue of humility that the apostles tried to live by. That was like unheard of in the rest of the world. So the forceful part of Paul, like nobody has a problem with that. Nobody has a problem with him being
normal.
forceful. But at times he has to defend why he tried to practice humility. And here I think he's connecting, like the humility I'm trying to live with is part of the way of Jesus, So that's
something I didn't realize that was like a weird thing to.
Oh yeah.
to
Like
be
the Roman
I'm
world didn't
humble.
really believe in
Being humble.
humility.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was just a sign that if you were acting like you were low down, that was just a sign that you were low down.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
now I would say that they would not have appealed. There's a difference between pride and arrogance, right? And somebody that was being overly arrogant, like outside. So let's say this. A lot of Roman world ethics were based on appropriateness. Okay, so the key there would be appropriately prideful. Like Caesar can be as prideful as he wants. He's Caesar, right? A general in Caesar's army can be prideful as long as they're not more prideful than Caesar, right? And the person that's working under the general can be prideful as long as they're not more prideful than the general. You understand? What I'm saying? Like
That makes sense.
Just as long you needed to be appropriately thoughtful about where your station was. Well, Paul's thinking about humility, and Jesus thinking about humility is that you don't exalt yourself, right?
Yeah.
You purposefully take the lower seat at the table, and
So is that what he's talking about when he says he's opposing those who think we are acting according to human standards? Are those the human standards that he's talking about?
I do think that's part of it. Yeah,
okay.
I think that's. I mean, I don't know if humility specifically is what he has in mind there, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised because that's a very that's a very natural part.
So
of
he's
Paul's
at the
theology.
top, basically, of this, like, of the order that you're talking about. Paul would be at the top.
Oh
in
yeah, well
this,
if you think about it, like
community.
he would be like a rabbi, and Paul talks often about how his station. Now that's an interesting question because the Christian church was like blowing apart a lot of norms like that.
Yeah.
Like the ladder just kind of exploded in the Christian church. But Paul could say, and I think Paul does say at times, like, I could have these kinds of status privileges among you as your teacher, as like the rabbinic kind of figure, but no,
Yeah.
I don't claim that. That's not the way. That's not the way we do things in the church. We don't claim exalted positions for ourselves. I think Paul kind of says that sort of stuff often.
That's cool.
And it's a reversal of the way a lot of people thought about humility and spirituality in the world. So anyway, that's one place though. Again, what we're looking for, the connections between the teachings of Paul and the things that Jesus himself taught or did. And that's more about Jesus' nature, right? Well, look at this next place. Let's look in, there's kind of a great mine of places in Romans chapter 12 and Romans 12 and 13. So if we kind of turn over there, there are several places where we can see these kinds of connections with Paul's teaching and what Jesus taught as well. If we look into, so if you think about the book of Romans, like the first 11 chapters like sets up a lot of theological kind of grounding, for what Paul's teaching, based on like the unity of the church is, I think, a lot of what Paul's teaching about there. But when he gets into chapter 12, he kind of is going to spin off into like all these like ethical implications of that. All right,
Romans is one of those books it's really long, and
Yeah.
so like when you're talking about, at the beginning of Romans, I don't know I haven't read it enough, or maybe even read pieces of it enough to know what's happening in the different parts.
Well, in the beginning, the first 11 chapters, like he's constructing like a fairly elaborate argument. Okay, and And you know how Ephesians is like the smaller scale version of this, right? Ephesians has
Okay.
those first 3 chapters that are very much like, this is what God has done for you, and like destroying the wall that the barriers between Gentiles and Jews, and bringing about like unity in Christ. And then like Ephesians 4 says, begins like, this is how you kind of live this out. Okay, like there's very
so
strict.
that's what Paul's
yeah.
doing in Romans.
Romans essentially does that too, in a lot of ways. Okay. It's not as strict a division is not as clean as it is in Ephesians, but largely it's true. And so you get some in chapter 12 in particular. You get kind of this stuff where he, like many of the books have. We talked about this in other places. Like you kind of almost get this rapid fire thing with like almost each verse is its own independent ethical exhortation. Okay. And I think through that there are several places where we could pick up echoes about the teachings of Jesus. One of those is in Romans 12, verse 14. Okay, and Paul is talking about. We'll just read this, right? Actually, let's back up. Let's just start in verse 9 because this whole section I think is worth. Romans 12, verse 9 and following. You want to read?
Sure.
Here, go ahead.
Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
All right, so there's lots of places in here, I think, where there are these like echoes of the teachings of Jesus.
You're right, this reads like Proverbs, kind of.
Actually, there's a place there is one part of these parts that's almost like a direct allusion to Proverbs. So, way to go. You
It
probably
sounds like that.
picked that up.
Right.
But it also sounds similar, as it would, sounding similar to Proverbs, to things like the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
In lots of ways. Okay? And there's a lot of thematic ties with what Paul says here to some of the things in the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, which is kind of Luke's version of that, right? So this is from the Sermon on the Plain. This is from Luke chapter 6, verse 28. Okay? It says this. Or 27 and 28. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them to do to you. Okay? Now, there's a lot of sections of this that I think kind of that Paul is alluding to a little bit, right? So in the passage in Romans, we heard very directly that section that says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them, right? Bless and do not curse is, pretty precisely what Jesus teaches his disciples, right? Bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, right? In this section of Romans, Paul's like kind of speaking about your attitude for people that are causing you harm. And a lot of what he has to teach here, okay, not only the bless and do not curse, but also do not repay evil for evil, okay, and leave, do not avenge yourself, but leave room for the wrath of God. Like all that part, like all of that is Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain kind of stuff. It's all stuff that alludes to the teachings of Jesus, that you don't sustain the conflict with your enemy, right? You have an enemy that hates you, and you treat them with love as much as you can, right? You turn the other cheek, and you don't take revenge on them and things like that. And it seems pretty clear to me that Paul is trying to show them, he's extending the teachings of Jesus in that phrase, right? Like that's just a very Jesus-y sort of language for Paul in that chapter. And I think I think it's really wonderful that he's kind of applying that into this new context. Now, he doesn't necessarily spell it out like, just as Jesus said, do this,
Right.
in this section. But it seems like if you were a Jesus follower and you had the teachings of Jesus from the sermon, some of his sermons, like it seems very likely that the Roman Christians that received this letter, when they heard this, I mean, they knew exactly what he was talking about, right? Like they knew that those have to do with the teachings of Jesus, that he's like
How would they have known about, just from what Paul had told them before, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, Paul, but also remember the network of other, disciples that are spreading that stuff too. So,
I always thought that like Paul was the only one that really went out to Rome, and then everyone else stayed like around Jerusalem and the Jews.
No. They all went in different directions, and we don't necessarily have records of all that. Okay, we know that later. This is a good question. In Jerusalem, the one that stayed in Jerusalem was James, right? The brother of the Lord, that writes the letter of James. And if you look into like Acts 15, you have the Jerusalem Council stuff. Like, who's really running the show there? Well, it's James. Like Peter's gone somewhere, and we don't. It doesn't necessarily speak to where. Now, there are places where there are lots of church traditions about like where the various apostles went and were martyred in like these other lands long later. Of course, the church tradition is that like the apostle John ends up in Ephesus. Okay, and that's kind of where he's one of the fathers of the church there. Okay. But so yes, these churches are Pauline. But it's not that division may not be as strict as you think. Okay, if you think about it, like when Paul writes the letter to the Galatians, like he writes about this experience that he had with Peter. It happened in Antioch. Okay, well Antioch is in Syria. Okay, so you're already a step removed out of Judea at that point. Okay. And he talks about like Peter he had been in Jerusalem, but he comes and he's visiting them, right? And then you have this other episode where in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul is talking about the resurrection, and he says, I already told you about, these first things, that when Jesus was crucified and he died and he was buried, and then he came back and he appeared to all these people, and he specifically lists that Jesus came back and he appeared to Peter and he appeared to James and to some of these other people, right? Well, what's the value in teaching them that or saying that to them if they don't already know who those people Peter is?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
okay.
Right?
No, that makes sense.
And so I think you can trace, hey, Paul's writing to a church in Corinth, it's ancient Greece, right? And he's talking to, like, he's assuming they already know something about some of these other characters in the story of Jesus.
Okay.
Whether they be apostles or maybe some of the other characters along the way.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So anyway, all that to say, there's some cross-pollination going on between the Jewish churches and their teachers that are part of that, and the Pauline churches as well. Remember, that's part of the problem. That part of the problem that Paul has is that there are these like Jewish Christians that are coming and telling them to be circumcised.
I was going to say that.
So,
you've got some people coming that are not necessarily like giving the right message, but that just shows you that there's people traveling and spreading out.
That's right. That's right. Or you think about like in the beginning of the church, or in the book of Acts, you have that story of Apollos, who is somehow comes into contact with Priscilla and Aquila, and he knows some things about John the Baptist, but he doesn't really like. I think it's an interesting story in its own right, because they come and they teach him more of the way of the Lord. Right, is kind of what happens, and I think you had all these pockets of people that maybe knew some stuff, and then they received somebody else from another wing of the church, and they offered them something else to teach, and sometimes that came with bits of stories about the Jesus. Eventually, somebody showed up with a copy of the Gospel of Mark.
Right.
Somebody showed up with a copy of Matthew, or maybe before that even they showed up with something that was kind of like the Sermon on the Mount that was like a set of. I think that's just very, very likely. You know, in fact, I'm sure that there were these kind of collections of Jesus's things that Jesus taught, and people that would just, by memory, share the things that Jesus taught over time. I think it's just very, very likely. So they knew. So it's enough for Paul to make that allusion, and I think people are going to connect that. And I'll tell you what, that to that point, there probably are many other places. Like if Paul's doing that in a book before the Gospels are written, there are probably other places that he's making allusions to something that everybody else knew that was part of the teaching of Jesus. Yeah.
We might not even know.
Yeah, it's not
it
not
didn't
included.
make it into a gospel. Or
Yeah, it's not included in the Gospels. Yeah, but we have it in like some different version in Paul that maybe not explicitly, indicated that way. I think that's
really interesting. I never thought about that.
I think that would make a lot of sense. Let's look at another place where Paul, an allusion to Paul's teaching or Jesus' teaching in Paul, and that's in Romans chapter 13. Okay, we're just kind of keep into this. Romans chapter 13, Paul talks a lot about like our relationship to government and governing authorities. Okay, and he says in verse, well, let's just read in verse 7 or 6 and 7. Okay. Or verse 5 and following. Therefore, one must be, this is Romans 13, verse 5 and following. Therefore, one must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Okay, now he's talking about like what it means to keep justice and order, and, by the sword. And he says this, pay to all what is due them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. Does that sound like anything to you? Mm-hmm. What does it sound like to you?
When
give you the stumping here.
The Pharisees came to test Jesus.
You're going to get it right.
And they say, should we pay taxes? And they're trying to trick him. And he said, give me a coin. And he said, whose face is on it? And they said, Caesar. And he said, give Caesar what is Caesar's. And give to God what is God's.
Rylan, I have to admit that you're exactly right. Okay.
That does sound a lot like that, though, right?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on, right? Like there's this moment where Jesus is like, they try to put him to the test by like having him challenged, about is he going to support Caesar or not? And he says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to. Well, that's the same language here, right, in Romans 13, where Paul says, hey, look, just pay your taxes, right?
Yeah.
Pay the taxes. And he actually extends it here, right, in these other categories like respect and honor.
It's like he's teasing out a little bit more of Jesus' teaching and extending it, like you were saying.
Yeah, so, You give to Caesar what Caesar is due, right? Becomes kind of this principle that you ought to pay people what they're owed, right? And now figuring out what respect or honor a person is owed. Remember, we talked about how like the ladder, okay, in the Roman world, it was very clear who was owed what kind of respect and what kind of honor. Now, I don't know, Paul kind of gives that, but in another, kind of like I think Jesus does. Like Jesus says, remember, he's not necessarily answering the question. He just says, you should give everybody what they're due. Yeah. Right? And now the question is like, well,
what are they due?
What are they really due? Yeah. Like, well, that's a good question. I think Paul kind of turns it back to that too, right? Like, but withholding honor, withholding respect for people that are due it because of the responsibilities they've been given by God.
Or revenue, if you're, especially if you have employees.
That's right. That's right. You got to pay people their wages, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's this other piece in Romans chapter 13. Let's see. I think there's one more thing. Yeah, in Romans chapter 15. Okay, we got one last little allusion to Jesus that I want to recognize. Okay, and it's more generalized. Like I don't know that it necessarily refers to a particular place in the Jesus story, but it's just kind of like a generalization about the character of Jesus. Well, let's just read it and we'll talk about it. So these are the first 3 verses of Romans 15. Actually, you know what? We're going to read the fourth verse as well because it's so relevant to this other study that we're doing. I don't want to skip it while we're close to it. We who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. So that's why he's trying to teach, right? If you're strong, you use your strength to please others, not just for yourself, okay? But how does he justify that? He says this: each of us must please our neighbor for the good purpose of building up the neighbor. Oh, that's interesting. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. And then the fourth verse is this: for whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope. Okay? All right, so notice how like Paul takes this this kind of principle of the life of Jesus, that Christ did not please himself. Now, where is that coming from? I don't know if there's like a particular verse that, we would point to there, but if you just know the contours of the Jesus story, think about like maybe think about the story of the prayer in Gethsemane where Jesus says, "Not my will, but yours be done," or maybe some other places where Paul says things or Jesus says things like, he tells the people that are persecuting him at one point, if I testify about myself, there's this whole principle of things where Jesus is not just bent on doing what he wants for his own benefit. Like that's just kind of a principle of the whole Jesus story and the cross and all of it, right? And so Paul here, in getting into something, he's going to get into something that has to do with, like this is the tail end of Romans 14. Is this like, should you eat meat offered to idols, which is like big controversy in their day, and in Romans, at the end of that, at the end of that conversation about which is really about how you navigate like differences in the community. At the end, he says, "Hey, we need to all keep in mind that we don't do things just to please ourselves. Like that's not our criteria, for what we choose to do." But to do that, he draws on the Jesus story in a broad picture. Okay. There was one last thing I mentioned I didn't pick up in Romans 13, and I had this one down particularly because it's pretty important, right? Look in. It's Romans 13. It's 8 and following. This is just after the piece that we read earlier. Boy, it would have been like a huge tragedy to leave this out. So give me a couple of minutes and we'll be done. He says, Romans 13, 8 and following, owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. That's interesting. Okay. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Which, of course, Jesus in his teachings, when he's asked, what's the greatest command, he says the greatest one is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the second command is to love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. And then he says, on all the law, on these two commands, all of the law and the prophets hang, right?
And that's the Shema?
Right? The love your Lord your God part is. The other one comes from Leviticus 19.
Does Shema mean word?
It means hear.
Hear. Okay. Is that similar to this, summed up in this word that he says right there? Like he uses the word, and word is like a really heavy word.
Summed up in this word, it means like in this command.
Okay. Yeah.
Boy, there's a lot there's a huge tangent to go on there.
Yeah. We'll do that another time.
Let's just do this real quickly, okay?
Yeah.
The Decalogue, the 10 Commandments,
10 words,
are the 10 words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
laws.
what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And he's citing what are known as the words.
Yeah.
Because he does that with these: that you shall not murder, steal, covet.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes
and then he says they're summed up in with this other commandment,
word.
Which is a word. He's kind of putting them on. I think he's putting them on par with those, or really above them.
And again, this is like just not adding, but like teasing out teaching of Jesus.
Yeah, he takes the teaching of Jesus, he applies it to these other commands and the 10 Commandments. The parts that are like related to the way that we respond to our neighbors, and it just seems really connected there, right? Look, the early church, whether it was Pauline or Johannine, a Petrine, that's the Peter version, yeah,
really?
right. No matter where they got it, they thought the teachings of Jesus were important,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just about all the theology that was about the atonement or the way that we're saved. It's also about following this way, the way of Jesus, right? Paul riffs on that in these texts. There's some other places too, and I just think that was. I think there are a lot of places where it's easy to imagine that Paul didn't think those were important because what he's doing is he's actually addressing some of their concern, But when he's teaching people about like how to live, a lot of that flows out of the life of Jesus, I think, And Jesus, Peter or Paul rather, is certainly capable of like coming to these places and drawing on the teachings of Jesus to encourage us as how to live. All right. Over the next few weeks, for our Wednesday night class, that'll be in the next week in the reception room. After that, in our outreach center, the gym here. We're going to look at some of these other teachings of Jesus. We're going to look for ways where they're connected to other parts of the early church. Whether that's the teachings of Paul or Acts or the letters of Peter or wherever. But we want it to be like the early church in that we always hold the teachings of Jesus central to who we are and to who we're becoming. Like we just always keep turning back to Jesus. Even when we're reading Paul, I think we're always keeping in mind that Paul is not out on his own, right? Paul says at one point, "Follow my example even as I follow Christ." Right? That's ultimately what he's trying to do. And we too want to be co-followers with Paul on the journey with Jesus. Okay? All right, grace and peace, guys. Thank you for joining in and being a part. Danny, I see you here at the very end.
Yeah, hey everyone that joined later.
And we're glad that you guys joined in with us.
That's right.
And we'll catch you sometime later.
Yeah.
Okay? All right.
Bye.
Grace and peace.